Okay, the stream has started, and today we go on with physical processes. We have seen up to now how we have subdivided the ecospheres of a planet, and we have seen how processes may be modeled in order to exchange substances between the various ecospheres. And today we start our lecture by giving a view and a watch on how nitrogen moves between the ecospheres. So we give a look on the tail of a nitrogen cycle. Why nitrogen? Nitrogen cycle is one of the most relevant biogeochemical cycles on our planet, on the surface of our planet. We have said that chemical element cycles within ecosystems. We have said that the elements essential for life, so that are relevant for the biosphere, is about 30 elements. We have seen that resources are not unlimited, so recycling is a fundamental aspect for life on our planet. Espera un segundo. Okay, sorry. We said that recycling is a fundamental aspect for life because the resources are not unlimited. So we shall give a look on how cycling happens through the different media, land, water, air, and so on. And this is why we refer to this as the geocycling, biogeochemical cycling of elements. And we have also said that cycling is essentially sustained by solar energy. That is the base of all energy processes on our planet. In particular, we may start by making some kind of schemas. We say that cycles that are relevant for life are nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and so on. For gaseous cycles like that of nitrogen, atmosphere is an important storage or reservoir and can play an important role in controlling the cycle. For example, this is the case for CO2 dilution and so on. And we may ask ourselves how this system, the atmosphere, how much this system is resilient, to what extent this system is resilient to cycles. When we will look at the biogeochemical cycle of phosphorus, we will notice a fundamental difference. Phosphorus cycles are essentially driven by sedimentary processes, and in this case, in the case of phosphorus, land is the main storage. And in this case, we shall notice that the cycle is less resilient, meaning that may happen that some minor perturbation may move significantly the equilibrium in the cycles. In particular, we may make a sketch by saying that solar energy is absorbed or used by producers, what we have called primary production, that transform inorganic forms of this element that cycles in the environment between air, land, and water. I recall you that air is a fundamental part of the cycle of nitrogen. Air or the atmosphere represent an important reservoir. Producers transform this inorganic form of elements into organic forms, that means biomass or organic chemicals. These organic forms are used by consumers. Consumers produces wastes. Wastes in organic form are used by decomposers that decompose it into inorganic forms. So the cycle is closed back into releasing nitrogen to inorganic forms. The nitrogen cycle, in order to understand the nitrogen cycle, we shall start by noting that nitrogen in gaseous form is a diatomic gaseous form, is inert, is an inert molecule because nitrogen in its diatomic form is built up on a strong triple covalent bonds. We have also said that 78% of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. Only 0.03% of nitrogen is found in Earth's crust, but nitrogen forms several compounds, of which most interesting ones are ammonia, that comes from bacterial degradation of organic nitrogenous substances, like for example fertilizers, or only few primary producers can exploit or use gaseous nitrogen N2 in order to transform it in organic forms of nitrogen. NH4 plus, the ammonium ions, is another important form. The nitric acid, that is strong acids, are also important forms. Then there are oxides of nitrogen like N2O, NO, and so on. And probably the most important ones are nitrate, NO3, and nitrite, NO2, that are salts of nitrous acids. And you may find these elements in several industrial processes, for example, in food processing industries, in which we NO2 nitrate act as a preservative. Why the nitrogen cycle is so important? Nitrogen is found in DNA, in vitamins, in amino acids, in proteins, chlorophyll, and so on. So these are all K molecules for biochemical and ecological processes. So let's say that nitrogen can be found ubiquitously in all organic matter. We said that nitrogen is abundant in the atmosphere, so this takes an important role in the gaseous cycle of this element. But as we said, fixation of this element is difficult because in the gaseous form, nitrogen is formed as N2, and N2 is a molecule that is built over a triple strong covalent bonds of nitrogen. This is why often nitrogen is a limiting nutrient for primary production. When we will describe the model for primary production, we will say, we'll give a look onto the limiting processes, and nutrient limitation, in this case, play an important role in terms of controlling how much of primary production may be fostered or may be based on the nitrogen cycle. Please keep in mind that some compounds of this element may be toxic, like is the case for nitrite and O2. And the importance of nitrogen cycle as a nutrient is relevant for several ecological processes that may dive into some cases of you see, destruction of equilibrium of nitrogen by producing some effects like, for example, eutrophication, that is a relevant dystrophic condition for coastal zones or for surface water bodies. The nitrogen cycle is very complex because we can find nitrogen but plays several roles, from oxidation numbers from -3, the case of ammonia, to +5, the case of nitrate. So you may find nitrogen into several different oxidation states. This is an idea of how complex is the nitrogen cycle in terms of how many processes take part to this cycle. For example, an important process of aeration. One is the passage of some gases from the atmosphere onto the biosphere or geosphere or hydrosphere, in particular this atmosphere onto the hydrosphere. This is a radiation, or we may say settling. We may look at settling, that is the movement of nitrogen forms, for example, from phytoplankton waste products that settles into the sediment, so in the form of detritus particulates, passing through also through the dissolved part. Oxidation processes like process number 5, so nitrate that is converted to nitrate and that is subsequently converted into gaseous nitrogen. And this is an important step, an important intermediate step of the process of denitrification. It is the real processes of nitrogen removal from an ecosystem. And then there's other processes, like, for example, more relevant for the biochemical cycle, like, for example, uptake or fixation or excretion. In case of uptake, for example, number 10, we may see that nitrogen in the form of ammonia is consumed by phytoplankton in order to sustain primary production. Atmospheric nitrogen, we say that is abundant, but it is inert because it is a very stable molecule. So before being used by living organisms, it must be somehow fixed. The nitrogen fixation from the gaseous form into the biosphere is made by bacteria like blue-green algae, bacteria that work in symbiosis with plants. For example, this is found in legume roots. In this case, nitrogen is fixed into organic nitrogen, and then nitrogen is fixed into organic nitrogen, and this is the case, for example, of uptake. And we have said that gaseous nitrogen N2 has a very stable triple bond, and symbiotic bacteria are needed to break it. So we have very specialized bacteria that are able to break these triple bonds in order to include or to implement nitrogen into their biomass. Plant then absorb ammonium or nitrates that are essentially soluble based on the fixed ammonium. So the first step is nitrogen fixation, that is the transfer of nitrogen from the gaseous form in the atmosphere onto the fixed form into organic biomass, organic molecules. This fixation may also happen through non-biological processes. For example, there are some cases in which atmospheric electricity, like thunders, may induce nitrogen fixation. So these are cases of fixation may be done through biological processes and abiotic processes. And then when nitrogen has a quite a complex cycle into the aquatic environment, in which we have a diffusion from the sediment of ammonia. So there is an exchange of ammonia in the aqueous form or dissolved from the sediment to a water column. Once ammonia is in the water column, it may be transformed or oxidized to nitrate and then subsequently to nitrate. and nitrate as well as ammonia may be uptaken, may be diffused, sorry, into a sediment. So ammonia as well as nitrate diffuse into the sediment. So we have an exchange, two directional exchange, in which we see that nitrate as well as ammonia passes from the aqueous solution into a solid. So it is absorbed, as we have seen. We may describe this by a process of adsorption. And then once into the sediment, nitrate and ammonia may be assimilated by plants through roots in order to transform it into organic molecules. Once nitrogen is fixed into organic substances, organic molecules, then there is a process like predation in which higher trophic levels tend to transfer this nitrogen from the primary production to the consumer's compartment. And then we have other processes like the process of ammonification that converts organic nitrogen into the inorganic forms like ammonia. And then subsequently we have the process of oxidation into nitrate and nitrate. Organic nitrogen as well interacts with the sediment through sedimentation processes, but also through resuspension processes. We have seen that we may model resuspension by our resuspension models that make the quantity of material transferred by the sediment into the water column dependent on conditions like the wind, speed, and depth of the water system. Then the final steps, or another important step in the process of nitrogen cycling is that of denitrification. In this case, nitrates are transformed into atmospheric nitrogen by denitrifier bacteria, and the cycle is closed. Nitrogen can also go into the atmosphere through volatilization of ammonia. So the two processes move nitrogen from the hydrosphere into the biosphere is, or into the atmosphere, sorry, is denitrification, conversion of nitrogen into gaseous nitrogen, but also volatilization essentially involves ammonia nitrogen or ammonium nitrogen. Ammonia volatilization, we may describe chemically this process by saying that ammonium NH3 in a gaseous form plus water is transformed into NH3 in the aqueous form. So this is transfer from the atmosphere into the hydrosphere, plus and then a subsequent passage of this is the transformation of ammonia into an ammonium ion NH4 plus in the aqueous form, and this is a dynamic equilibrium between NH4 plus and the hydronium ion OH minus in the aqueous form. This is also called stripping, this process, and in waters or soil with high pH, this is the main process of removing of transfer of nitrogen. For example, water bodies in summer, in which the temperature is 8, the pH in this case is increased by photosynthetic production, but increases the pH. In cases of low temperature, this is a very slow reaction, and the process may also be used in wastewater treatment plant, which we have low flows, for example, adding lime to control or to increase pH. Another important process in the nitrogen cycle is nitrogen mineralization, or so-called ammonification. In this case, proteins and other forms of organic nitrogen are decomposed into ammonium. In this case, bacteria degrade nitrogen compounds and incorporate this element into the produced ammonium. they need. The excess is then released as ammonium ions. This is the part of the cycle we have seen before, in which we have a movement of nitrogen from the organic form in the biosphere of the biomasses, and through ammonification, this transfers into the hydrosphere. Then the subsequent step is that of nitrification. Nitrification is the oxidation of ammonium into nitrate, and this is done by Nitrosomonas bacter, and after that, some cases into nitrate. This is done by the Nitrobacter. Nitrobacter is a chemoautotrophic bacteria, but we use exothermic reaction of oxidation of ammonia and nitrates as energy sources and CO2 as a carbon source. It is important to note that this process is strongly controlled by the presence of oxygen. So, in order to proceed into a complete denitrification process, that is conversion of nitrate into gaseous nitrogen, we need also anoxic conditions. The biological processes of nitrification is that of conversion of ammonium nitrogen into nitrate and subsequently into nitrate. So we have two subsequent chemical processes. The first one is carried out by nitrosomonas that convert NH4 plus by employing oxygen into nitrate plus water plus some protons. In this case, we may represent this reaction by a first order chemical reaction, in which we say that the variation of nitrogen in the form of ammonia is equal to minus K1, so equilibrium constant for the chemical reaction, multiplied by the quantity of nitrogen in ammonium form. In America, we have seen this type of model several times. This is a first order chemical reaction, or if you want a first order dynamic process, or first order differential equation that describes this process, and the equilibrium is described by the constant K1. The second step, but carried by Nitrobacter, when we have that nitrate plus oxygen, so in this case we need some oxygen, is converted into nitrate. Again, we employ a first order dynamics with a different chemical equilibrium constant K2. The important point to keep in mind is that K2 is much larger than K1. So this means that ammonia oxidation is the limiting process in the sense that the second process K2 is much faster than the first process K1. This means that as soon as we have nitrate formed, then we will have almost immediately the formation of nitrate. This is why, in general, we expect to find more nitrate than nitrate in aquatic ecosystem. And we also said that nitrate may be toxic, so this is an important aspect in order to maintain suitable conditions for life in aquatic ecosystem. We said that ammonia oxidation is the limiting process, meaning that once ammonia is oxidized, then the second step, that is the subsequent oxidation of nitrate, is much faster. But this is not, this is the general condition, but for high temperatures in which the speed of reaction, I recall you that all these chemical equilibrium constants depend through an Arrhenius-like model on temperature. So in the case of higher temperature, we may have a switching of this equilibrium, for example, a slight increase in the K1 constant as well. These processes depend strongly on pH conditions. In particular, with these graphs, we try to describe how pH may influence these two processes. We see that, for example, the case of ammonia oxidation, the first type of the nitrification process, we follow a dashed line, we have an optimum light condition, so there is a maximum around pH between 7.5 and 9.5. We have a similar condition for nitrate oxidation, in which, however, the optimum is a little bit switched more to the right, so more to the higher pH conditions. So the optimum pH condition for nitrate oxidation is a little bit higher, around 9 values of pH. So optimum pH for nitrification, you shall recall, is between 8 and 9, and there is a strong dependence on alkalinity, of course, because there is a strong dependence on the pH of the solution. This, of course, this plot displays the percent of maximum rate of process. The dashed line refers to ammonia oxidation, and the continuous line refers to nitrate oxidation into nitrate. In the case of nitrification, temperature influences the maximum reaction rate. We have, in general, we may say we have an exponential growth between 10 to 22 Celsius degrees, while the speed of the process remain constant between 30 and 35 Celsius degrees, and tends to diminish after 35, so between 35 and 40, and in general, when we are around 50 Celsius degrees, the process stops. Of course, there are other limiting factors: presence of moisture, bacteria needs water to survive, and there are monokinetics that may be described by this differential equation, but as well are first order differential equation in which we have we describe the variation of this process by evaluating the concentration, for example, of ammonia, and we have a maximum value of the rate of the reaction, mu max, that may be reduced by other factors, like, for example, the quantity of ammonia that is taken away from yield, or from predation, or from consumption processes. The key aspect is that all these kinetics, as we will see more in detail next week, are described by mono-like kinetics, what is formalized in mathematical terms through a Michaelis-Menten function, that is the function expressed by these two ratios. Okay, denitrification, the process is the closest nitrogen cycle, is a reduction process taking place in anoxic condition. Please note, anoxic condition for denitrification. In this case, nitrate acts as an electroreceptor and can be reduced to ammonium, to gaseous nitrogen N2, or to one of the following oxides. In this case, again, there is an interaction between the aquatic environment, the sediments through settling and suspension, and the atmosphere through ammonia volatilization or denitrification. Denitrification is the process in which NO3 nitrate plus organic substances is converted into gaseous nitrogen plus CO2. This process is carried by facultative bacteria. They can adapt their metabolism to use nitrates as electron receptors when oxygen lacks. Please note, oxygen lacks. This means that in order to have a complete denitrification process, you need to find anaerobic conditions. So anoxic environment is needed in order to complete the process of denitrification. Consumption of organic substance may happen through several configurations of wastewater treatment plants to sustain the process without discharging ammonia. So it is a potential limiting factor organic substance is a potential limiting factor for the process of denitrification. So in order to have a denitrification, a complete denitrification process, you need an oxide condition and a source of organic substances in order to make this reaction complete. The process rate, of course, increases by the kind of substrate meaning organic substances, for example, methanol or sewage. Denitrification takes place within pH ranges between 6 to 10, and the optimum values, in this case, it is between 7.5 and 9. Oxygen inhibits the process. In this case, it becomes a limiting factor, but in general, it is not a problem in wastewater treatment plant because it is consumed by facultative bacteria that oxidate organic substance. All these nitrogen processes are relevant, for example, if we want to study or to employ wetlands as phytodepuration mechanism, phytodepuration techniques. This is the only way to treat diffuse pollution. While point pollution may be treated by collecting wastewater into wastewater treatment plants, in the case of diffuse pollution, you cannot, of course, collect all the water through wastewater treatment plant because the volumes at play are too much, so large. In this case, you may employ for diffuse pollution wetland systems in which you have nitro and denitro processes that are based on nitrogen oxidation and then oxygen absence in order to carry on the denitrification process. Such contrasting conditions are found, for example, on the roots of common reed phragmites, for example. This is why reeds for our wetland plants may act an important role in taking away nitrogen for your water system. I recall you that the only true processes for removing nitrogen from a water body are denitrification, so the complete cycle of nitrogen oxidation and then nitrate transformation to gaseous nitrogen, and ammonia volatilization. In the case of nitrification, the first step needs oxygen, so oxygen that is brought through the leaves to the roots of the plant in order to carry on the first step of the process. In this case, oxygen is transferred down to the root, and then from the root, in wetlands, we have denitro based on nitrogen oxidation and oxygen absence. So in order to remove nitrogen in wetlands, we shall study nitrification processes that happen in the rhizosphere through bacterial films but oxidized in the sediment zone. Denitrification typically happening in the bottom because I recall you that denitrification requires anoxic conditions. Ammonia volatilization, that is the transfer process from the hydrosphere into the atmosphere, but as we have seen last week. Plant uptake, that is transfer of material from, for example, sediment to the lithosphere on the dissolved part in the hydrosphere and to the biosphere. This is uptake, typically ammonium and nitrates, limits this process. And then we have burial, that is interaction with deep sediments, in which you may have other important processes that are altering the condition of molecules like nitrates or ammonia through ion exchange processes. Nitrogen oxides and atmospheric deposition. The biosphere and the atmosphere essentially exchange nitrogen through exchanges of nitrogen oxides like NOx. For example, enzyme combustions produce nitrogen oxides, and vice versa, we may have dry deposition, for example, or wet deposition or acid rains that transfer nitrogen oxides and may induce some chemical reaction of further oxidation by converting the nitrogen oxides in these nitric acid. Goldie in 1990, stated that deposition alone can lead to higher than European Community limit for drinkable waters nitrate levels in drainage water. In Southeast UK, this is a paper that appeared in the early 90s, in which it was demonstrated that one of the sources of contamination of drinkable water may be through wet or dry deposition of nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere. So in order to resume, what are the processes of nitrogen cycle the environmental engineer should know? First of all, nitrogen fixation, soil microorganisms in symbiosis with some plants. For example, legumes fix atmospheric nitrogen and transforms it into organic nitrogen. Nitrogen accumulation, this is bacterial uptake, but are heterotrophic bacteria or soil organisms that convert ammonia to organic compounds like proteins. Ammonification, that is the decomposition of proteins and other forms of organic nitrogen into ammonium. Nitrification, so oxidation of ammonium through nitrite and nitrate. It is carried by nitrosomonas and nitrobacter. I recall you that in this case you need an organic matter substrate in order this process to take part. Denitrification, that is a reduction process taking place in an oxic condition in which nitrate acts as an electron acceptor and it can be reduced to gaseous nitrogen or become some other nitrogen oxides that may be found into the atmosphere. And finally, but very relevant, the process of ammonia volatilization that converts nitrogen ammonium into ammonium, nitrogen ammonium ion into ammonia into the atmosphere and transfers it into the atmosphere. It is important to note that not all forms of nitrogen are equally be available. In particular, the bioavailable forms for organic nitrogen are the dissolved or particulate forms, while in the case of inorganic forms of nitrogen, ammonia, nitrate, and nitrate are the most bioavailable forms. Please note that ammonia is much much smaller than nitrate or nitrates. This means that if you have bacteria that can consume or can feed on nitrogen, on ammonia and nitrate or nitrogen oxides, they will first of all consume ammonia because it is easier, being smaller, to pass through the cell membrane and so to be included into the cell and processed by the cellular. I recall you that in order to evaluate the quantity of nitrogen available for biological processes, it is often used the total nitrogen in the form of total kilonal nitrogen, that is the organic nitrogen plus ammonia, that are the forms that are essentially converted into organic forms by bacterial processes. Okay, and this concludes our treatment of nitrogen cycle. Now we finish our lectures today by discussing first distributed parameters model. Sorry. I'm changing. Okay. The first diffused parameter models that describes or tries to describe how nitrogen and phosphorus, so these nutrients, may be generated into a large watershed basins. These distributed parameter models, what we are going to look at now, is a model based on a geographical information system (GIS). As we said often, when you need to model large spatial ecosystem, largely distributed, spatially distributed ecosystem, you need geographical information system. And when I think geographical information systems, I think softwares like ArcInfo, ArcView, but also GRASS, what is the geographical resource analysis and support systems. The two differences between ArcInfo and ArcView, what are produced by Esri, what is a software house, and GRASS, is that GRASS, it is an open source product produced by the US Corp of Engineers, of Civil Engineers, and it is an open source product, but it is absolutely equivalent from the point of view of the calculation capability to the other two softwares, ArcInfo and ArcView. But of course, it is much cheaper being open source. It is a free software. The difference, the drawback is that you do not have a very easy to use graphical user graphical interfaces or graphical user interfaces. Instead, you drive or you use GRASS GIS systems, graphical resource analysis super system, through shell. So essentially through command in a Unix shell system. These software are fundamental for land management, are fundamental if you want to build the decision support systems based on geographically distributed information, and of course are fundamental for geographical modeling, so that is distributed parameter models in our language. In this case, by employing of this geographical information system, you can manage a very large quantity of data that are geolocalized on the territory, typically satellite images or remote sensing data that can be implemented into a calculation environment that may be employed to build a model. What is a geographical information system? Very quickly, geographical information system provides a description of a portion of land, and essentially we may say that GIS combine information layers, and the layer used depends on the purpose of the description you want to implement. For example, you may ask yourself the best location for a shop, or studies of social characteristics like crime or unemployment, or the analysis of factors of environmental damage and so on. You may have several layers describing all these factors, and by GIS calculation, you may combine these layers and produce an output. Essentially, the GIS consists of hardware, computers, peripherals, plotters, and so on. Software, ArcInfo, ArcView, GRASS, MapInfo, or whatever. There are several types of GIS softwares. A large amount of data, typically satellite data or remote sensing data, imagery data, and staff that is appropriately trained in order to manage the system. Staff and training means that these systems are not so trivial to use and to implement. Instead, often it is needed good training and specialized staff in order to build these kind of systems. The elements of a geographical information systems are a coordinate system, what is made up of scales and projections and data, and then data. Data are may find in shape files that typically may be seen as points. So points are triplets of numbers identifying points in a three-dimensional space, or maybe vectors. Vectors are objects that are identified by an origin and a length and a direction, or in the case of a non-object oriented description, you may employ raster maps. Raster maps are geographical maps in which in each cells you may have a set of attributes describing the characteristics of that portion of land. Please note that points and vector maps shapefiles are independent from the resolutions of a coordinate system, while raster maps, that are essentially photographs, are dependent on the resolution, being resolution the lowest resolution, the dimension of a pixel describing the portion of land you want to describe. To each of the objects that you may find in data shapefiles, you may associate an unlimited set of attributes, a table of values describing the various characteristics of a system. By employing this kind of software, GIS, we have built a model that is called Mces modeling nutrient emissions into river system. The model was developed by Horst Behrendt in Berlin in 1999, so 20 years ago, by the Federal Agency for the Environment, in German Umweltbundesamt. What are the model characteristics from a point of view from what we have described in the previous lecture? It is a steady state model in which we have distributed parameters approach, meaning that the parameters changes according to their position. The spatial scale is that of a hydrologic unit, typically a sub-basin. In the case of application that we will see today is larger than 50 square kilometers, and also temporal scale, in the case of Mces model, is annual, pluriannual, or if you want, seasonal, because the process that we are going to implement are a process that refers to an annual cycle or to a seasonal cycle. The objective of this model is that of evaluating emissions and residual loads conveyed through different pathways, namely groundwater, surface runoff, and so on, and fraction due to different sources, like, for example, agricultural, civil, or urban spread, and so on. How is the model structured? What the objective of the model is to evaluate nutrient loads in forms of phosphorus or nitrogen in large hydrological basins or catchments, river catchments. The model is based on, is constructed by collecting data into an input file that is with basic info, in which we include, for example, we subdivide our catchment into small sub-basins, sub-catchments. So for all the sub-catchments, we include the area, the surface. Then for all the sub-basins, we include an evaluation of discharge in terms of average annual discharge or annual average load of nitrogen or phosphorus and so on. We include some information concerning statistics of municipalities, like the number of inhabitants or the surface of the arable land. And then we include some very detailed information concerning land use. Land use is very relevant characteristics governing the way nutrients or pollutants are transferred throughout the various geospheres. Then we include information on the pedology, so quality of soil, the typology of soil, in terms of annual average erosion, or in terms of sand content or clay content, and so on. We include some information on the geology, In terms of consolidation or unconsolidated soil, we include information on the choreography, for example, the slope. We include information concerning the climate, like, for example, precipitation, rain, and atmospheric deposition. We include information concerning agricultural activities in terms of agricultural surplus. So, in terms of agricultural surplus evaluated in nitrogen and phosphorus, and we include information urban system, number of inhabitants, but basin, number of treated, and number of untreated, average length of sewage systems, separated and non-separated sewage systems, and so on. We know that the difference between separated and non-separated is very relevant because the separated sewage systems are dramatically influenced by precipitation. The pathways considered by the model are this one, include atmospheric deposition, surplus, which is agricultural activity, erosion, which is condition of the topsoil, and movement of topsoil due to water, surface runoff, groundwater, that is the large storage of all these elements, nitrogen and phosphorus, overland flow, that is the flow on the surface, point sources, so it is discharges through out of wastewater treatment systems, urban systems, and urban system means difference of land cover, paved land, and so on, or impact due to anthropic activity on the territory, and then the background condition of nitrogen or phosphorus generation with large river catchment. So all these pathways convey nutrients, but typically found in as surplus in the topsoil. In this case, you have exchanges. Nutrients in the topsoil may be charged by atmospheric deposition or by point sources with local discharges from wastewater treatment plants. So these increment the quantity of nutrient surplus in the topsoil. Then these nutrients in the topsoil may be evacuated through erosion or surface runoff directly onto a catchment closure or catchment outlet. And then we may have from topsoil direct leaching of nutrient from the root zone directly into the groundwater through base flow and interflow. We may consider retention and losses in the unsaturated zone, and then retention and losses in the groundwater. So you see, we are trying to combine a very large set of processes involving nutrient transfers from the topsoil into the water system through surface runoff and rivers, and then groundwater flows. Atmospheric deposition, this pathway considers emission due to direct atmospheric deposition on water surfaces. Surplus calculates the concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil as a function of clay content and amount of fertilizer manure. So this surplus considers agricultural activity. Erosion from agricultural land is a significant release of suspended solids and nutrients. When we have groundwater, but it is the part of ecosystems that receive all the remaining flows from precipitation that infiltrates. It is loaded of nutrients bypassing from the topsoil. Before arriving to the closure, several processes can take place into the groundwater system, such as denitrification, phosphorus release under anaerobic condition, and so on, and this makes the groundwater pathway quite complicated to evaluate in terms of nutrient transformation. Then from the groundwater, we consider the overland flow, that is the surface runoff in areas not paved, so not urban areas, and nutrient concentration and determination are generally determined by the soil type. But you may recall that the soil type may act as a filter. When we have point sources that are discharged from sewage treatment plants and industries, urban systems, so during the events of rain, most of the water collected from drains is bordered in the receptor water bodies. So you may know that in this case, during events of rain in urban system, you may have significant uh, first flush load of nutrients as a discharge. When tile drainage is related to emission from agricultural and land drainage systems. And finally, the background pathway. How do we combine all this? This is a very simple model that is built on a spreadsheet tables. We have an input data, basic input. From this input data, we calculate nitrogen and phosphorus with the different pathways. All these represent different spreadsheet files, and then all the results are collected into the output file that is called monaries. This is an example of how the pathways in the urban areas maybe are included into the model. So we have households or industrial indirect discharges. We may have traffic or exomental liter fell or atmospheric deposition. All these uh, ways, all these pathways of nutrient loads are vehiculated through these spreadsheet tables, spreadsheet files that we've seen before. So then we have groundwater, separate sewer system, or combined sewer system. So you see, we differentiate with several aspects that are of relevance in order to understand how to manage very large catchment. When you have all these pathways are brought, vehiculated to the surface water recipient of the river system. Then we have a retention model implemented, that is again a sigmoidal saturation model that is calculated by regression on several experimental data on several large river basins all over Europe. With each spot, each point represents river basin somewhere in Europe, and so you see that there is a relationship between the specific runoff and the ratio between uh, the total nutrient, in this case, total phosphorus transport and total phosphorus emissions. So when we go to 1, this means that all that is emitted in that area is transported into the water body. We have these models applied for total phosphorus or for the dissolved inorganic nitrogen. These two models that describe the ratio between load and emissions are very simple models whose equation is this one. We have two calibration parameters, A and B, and the calibration parameter are changed in order to find the best fit of all these points, all these measured spots, in order to find a calibration, a satisfactory calibration for this model. The application we are going to look now very quickly is onto the Po catchment. The Po catchment is, the Po River is one of the largest rivers in Europe, one of most important 5 or 6 rivers in Europe. This is the catchment of the Po River, northern Italy. These are the Alps and this is the Apennines, and this is the Po Valley. The Po River main flow part starts from the area of Torino and goes down through Ferrara and discharges into the northern Adriatic Sea. So you see, we are trying to apply a nutrient generation model that tries to evaluate how much of a nutrient generated in a portion of a catchment is brought into the outlet, so into the coastal zone. And we are applying this model in a very large system. In this case, the area of a Po catchment is more than 70,000 square kilometers, and in a very human impacted area. In this case, we have a population of 17 millions of inhabitants, but more or less, these are figures of the year 2000. Today we are slightly more than 70 millions, 17 millions, but you see in this area we have a very important concentration of Italian population, almost we may say one third of Italian population. As a consequence, this area has a very relevant national economic importance. It contributes 40% of the gross domestic product, 46% of employment, and we're talking about country scale. So in Italy, 37% in Italy of industrial production comes from this area, 35% of agriculture comes from this area, and 55% of cattle growth comes from this area. The agriculture, we have 3.4 million hectares, so 45% of agricultural arable land is we produce wheat, maize, fodder, barley, sugar, beet, rice, horticulture, and fruits. So this is staple food. And then we have 1 million hectares that are permanent meadows and pasture lands in which we produce 4 millions of cattle and 5 millions of pigs. So you can imagine that cattle and pigs as well has a relevant impact in terms of nutrient loads, of nitrogen and phosphorus. The average discharge of a Po river is 1,500 cubic meter per second, so it is a very, very large river. This figure is obtained through averages over the last 60 years, or the last 100 years of a discharge, not 100, but 60 years of a discharge along the Po river. The closure of the basin for our application is in Ponte Lago Scuro, this point. So in the area of Ferrara, in which we consider the nutrient generated by the catchment arriving here and then discharged into the Northern Adriatic Sea. The estimation provided by the Po Catchment Authority is 100,000 tons per year of nitrogen and 9,000 tons per year of phosphorus, of which diffuse sources contribution, diffuse I mean agriculture, are 63% for nitrogen and 42% for phosphorus. Of course, nitrogen is more vehiculated through diffuse sources. So we have subdivided the Po catchment basins into 33 subcatchments this month that are each crossed by the Po River main flow area. So to this Po River main flow area, there is a contribution of all the other basins around. And then of every 33 subbasins, we have found gauging stations for which we measure the discharge in output and the concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus at the output. Of course, we have to include some kind of topological descriptions in which we try to make a relationship linking all the upward basins, uphill basins, but discharging to a subbasins. For example, in two subbasins, 11 is one, or let's focus on two subbasins, well, 11, yes. We have the contribution of all the uphill basins that are 4, 6, 8, 5, 9, and so all these subbasins are discharging topologically through into the subbasin 11. And this is accounted by inclusions to the description of the catchment of an equation that links the net flow, the net discharge to the total discharge. The net discharge is the discharge due to the surface of subbasins, while the total discharge is the discharge due to the surface of the subbasin plus all the subbasins that are uphill to the subbasin we are considering. In this case, okay, we have data on runoff and nutrient loads in these forms. We have to include several information concerning municipalities, so we use ISTAT cells. So for each subbasin, we have made some GIS. All these data are produced by GIS calculation. This is why you need GIS for making this kind of analysis. So you combine, for example, you cut all the ISTAT subunits that fall into a subcatchment, and then you evaluate the contribution of these ISTAT subunits into the catchment. Note that we have more than 6,000 ISTAT subunits, and for each one of these subunits, we need information of the quantity of inhabitants, total area from statistical report, and the quantity of arable land. We then include some geographical information like land use, which is according to land use obtained from satellite images. You see in red we have cities, while in blue we have water systems, and in the other colors we have different type of land use. We include information on the geology. Here the source is the drainage authority of the Po River. We include digital elevation model because we need to compute slopes, and this is the graph of the plot of the slope obtained by GIS calculation. The source here is the USGS, United States Geological Service, where we include very rough information concerning climate. In this case, precipitation. This data comes from the Global Panel for Climate Change, in which we make some statistical calculation concerning the yearly or summer and winter precipitation on data that fall into the model. We include also evapotranspiration, okay? And then we include some very rough data concerning atmospheric deposition at the European level. We include information concerning nitrogen surplus due to agricultural activities. Nitrogen surplus is calculated by summing the quantity of fertilizer plus manure employed in agricultural activity and subtracting the quantity of nitrogen and phosphorus subtracted by yield. So we use figures for nitrogen in kilograms per hectares per year of nitrogen and in kilograms per hectares of phosphorus, but in this case in the long term. So we make averages of 50 along 50 years. This is due to the fact that the dynamics of phosphorus are much more slower, being phosphorus dynamics connected to the solid transport essentially. We include information concerning wastewater treatment plants. So for each subcatchment, we include how much phosphorus and nitrogen is discharged by wastewater treatment plant. We collect all this information in the basic info general table, which contain the topological description of a catchment, and then we start obtaining some results. For example, we calibrate the model by employing data on discharge for every 33 subbasins. So each point here is 1 point for each of the 33 subbasins. And we have calibrated the model by changing the parameters, the calibration parameters, in order to force what is calculated by the model and what is measured through the gauging station in terms of discharge, forcing them to fall into a one-to-one plot. What this means? This means that we are not making an hydraulic model. Instead, we assume that we know how much water is passing through because we know we have figures concerning discharge, and we try to calibrate my model that includes information on the population, on the climate, on the land use, on the land cover, and so on. We force the model to reproduce the water flows that we can measure. This is why this is a perfect. It is not really a perfect because we are not making a hydraulic model here. We are forcing the parameters of a nutrient generation model in order that the hydraulic aspects are replicated perfectly. We do the same for example, dissolved in organic nitrogen and total phosphorus. So now, in reality, we calibrate the discharge, and then we see point by point what happens for the 33 subbases in terms of dissolved in organic nitrogen and total phosphorus. As we see, as we increase, for example, dissolved in organic nitrogen load over dissolved in organic nitrogen calculated, the model works better and better because the variations due to plus and minus oscillations are absorbed by going to the larger subbasin. This happens for dissolved organic nitrogen and for total phosphorus as well. These graphs show you the deviation of estimated loads by subbasins. So for each of the 33 subbasins, we measure how much our model is going out from a 30% uh, per 30% significance interval. And then we subdivide the loads in terms of contribution due to different sources. This is the final table of the model. Here we are comparing blue spots are measured spots, pink spots are calculated by the model spots. This is for nitrogen and this is for phosphorus. And we are evaluating along the length of the main Po River course. So this is the spring and this is the outlet or the delta of the Po River. So we go and by running along the river, we see how our estimations that are calculated fit or do not fit with the measured values. So during the calibration process, is a graphical calibration process in which we change the parameters in order to make the two lines the most close as possible. The models also provide tables like this in which there are the total emissions are subdivided by proportion of the different pathways. In particular, we have atmospheric deposition, tile drain, the groundwater, ground flow, and erosion, wastewater treatment, and urban systems are the different pathways considered by the model, and these are the differences for nitrogen and phosphorus. If we sum, the total is that we have 164,000 tons per year of nitrogen. I recall you that the figure, first estimation in the late 80s, early 90s was 100,000 tons of nitrogen per year. For phosphorus, we are 7,000 tons of phosphorus per year. I recall you that the figure provided in the late 80s, early 90s was 9,000, so we are not so far from figure provided by other means. And then we have a subdivision of the different contribution for the different sources. For example, in light violet, we have nitrogen, and in dark violet, we have phosphorus. And it is evident, for example, that for the groundwater pathway, the relevant nitrogen is transported most relevantly by the groundwater pathway, while, for example, phosphorus is vehiculated essentially by overland flow, that is erosion. You know that phosphorus goes with the solid transport, but also with tile drainage, wastewater treatment plant, and urban system, and so on. By this kind of application, we may generate this kind of maps. These are total nitrogen and total phosphorus emission maps of the flow catchment. So we see that which are the catchments that more impact in terms of nutrient generation. And then we may identify critical spots. For example, the area immediately downhill from Milano is a critical spot in terms, for example, of total nitrogen concentration milligram per liter. And all the area in the delta region, so in the outer downward of the river, is very critical in terms of very large nutrient loss. Of course, all these parts of the river presents fields of very strong agricultural activities that is taking place in the uphill subbasins. By this model, we may evaluate scenarios by changing some of the parameters in terms, for example, of density of population or availability of wastewater treatment plants and so on. So we have evaluated 6 scenarios, business as usual, into flavors based or high in terms of nutrient protection or policy targets. So it is different levels of implementation of the policy targets, and then the deep green scenarios, what is the scenarios in which we are very good in reducing nutrient loss and treating what is not reduced. So what we see from these scenarios, that we have for nitrogen, the model was based on the year 2000, so we made estimation for 2016 scenarios estimation for 2016. So we have an increase in percent of nitrogen production in the business as usual scenario, but we have a significant decrease in the deep green, and also in the case of phosphorus. In the case of nitrogen, the decrease is not so pronounced like in the case of phosphorus. Instead, it is maybe very pronounced if we are able to apply policy targets or deep green scenarios and so on. Okay, I stop here. Sorry for being late, but this was an important lecture and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have any question, I'm ready to answer your questions. Or if you want what we discuss more in details with distributed parameters models, but is applied on a very large catchment, a very heterogeneous condition, in which we make some very large approximation, but nevertheless, we obtain some significant results that may be useful in order of quality of environment evaluation, but also in order to discuss or to identify more suitable management scenarios for these complicated ecosystems. Okay, I stop here. If you have any question, please go ahead. And if you have any question, well, we close